All right. I apologize to people who are fundamentalistically religious, which I doubt there are too many in this room, because this is going to be a quasi, from my personal point of view, a kind of a religious, in quotes, reinterpretation of Genesis. I think you'll enjoy this. I think this is very good. Now, the world begins when God creates the universe, and it's not very interesting at the beginning, although it moves very fast. I mean, first there is a void, right? There's nothing. Then he creates the earth, and still there's nothing. And then you know what he starts to do? He starts to talk to himself. You know what I'm talking about? God is talking to himself. The first hallucinator. Let there be light. Well, why does he have to be let there be light? He can just make light. Who is he talking to? There's nobody there. Now, to me, this indicates absolute identity, which is a very old idea also, of thought and action. Now, obviously, as we grow older, we interpose restraints in between this. But the little children talk about what they're going to do, often in the third person, and of course also talk aloud. It takes quite a bit of doing to learn not to talk aloud. Talk to themselves. These are natural things, talking to yourself. If this is a psychiatric symptom, then we are in a bad way. Now, of course, nothing is a psychiatric symptom because there are no psychiatric diseases, but that makes it simple. Well, let's go through this thing as I see it. The drama begins then, the story really begins when they start to talk. Now, what do they talk about? The drama begins when Satan challenges Eve to eat the forbidden fruit. Now, Eve hesitates. This is the very beginning of the Bible, of the Old Testament. Eve hesitates, fearing God's punishment. Quotes, God has said, you shall not eat of it. Listen carefully, because every word is very important here. God has said, you shall not eat of it, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. Genesis 3:3. Now Satan, the next line, reassures her that God will, and it depends on how offensive or polite I want to be here. One could use all kinds of words here. I could say that God will welch on his threat. One could also say that God is lying, is threatening, is pretending. The serpent said unto the woman, you shall not surely die. The next line. You shall not surely die. The rest, as they say, is history. We could interpret this brief, grand parable in the following several ways. This is now my formulation. First, child abuse. The first historical case of child abuse. Lured to disobey their father's warning, two children yield to the seducer and suffer the consequences. The first case of advertising. Invited to enlarge the repertoire of desires, two consumers yield and their expectations are amply fulfilled. The first case of research. Persuaded to try a risky experiment, two investigators undertake it and improve their understanding of their environment. They learn the difference between right and wrong. And finally, the first case of a verdict of insanity, of finding culprits not guilty by reason of insanity. Guilty of a capital crime, the judge fails to punish the criminals as required by his own law and sentences them instead to life imprisonment. I'm borrowing from Sartre. It's just an interpretation of